All right, we're live.
Yay, welcome.
Welcome.
So, Wayne, you want to say something?
Well, we're still working on Detering's, and I forgot the title of the book now, The Fabricated Paul. And we're continuing where we left off 2 weeks ago. And I believe that means we're still in chapter 2. I forgot actually what page we left off on.
150. No, I forgot what page it was actually. 120 was it? I forgot.
I watched
Yeah.
most of the video of that, but unfortunately I didn't watch the whole thing.
Yeah, 120 is sounds reasonable. 129 is chapter 3, yeah, so, yeah. So 120 sounds about where we left off. We had about a dozen pages for the last remaining.
I think the first thing I'd like to say is that when I first read this book, I was just kind of commencing my my Bible geekery, and so it's been a while. And I was a lot more ready to accept all its various theses, and now that I've done a bunch of reading since these days, I'm a lot more critical. And I'm glad we're reading it, actually, because reading it again like this, I'm a lot more critical of it. Neither good nor bad, but at least I'm more informed about Marcion and things like that.
But we don't have to accept it all or nothing, though. He may make a lot of good points. You know, when he says
Yeah.
what he says, and not the whole.
Totally.
So,
I noticed that I sometimes when I read a new theory like this, I try it on for size in a way. I embrace it for a while and walk around with it and see how it feels, and I give it time to see all the sorts of things that don't work all of a sudden, you know. But it takes time with me, so I may speak sometimes as if I'm totally on board, but that's usually my methodology until I eventually reject it. So at first,
No, yeah, that's cool.
I've made some posts that indicated that I thought that Marcion did write the Pauline Gospels, but I don't. That's not where I'm at anymore. But I was open to it, and I wanted to see where that led and what the implications of that were. But
No, yeah, that's cool. I appreciate. By the way, Dale, I've appreciated all your postings. The posts that you do post reflect what you just said, and I think it's a pretty good hermeneutic, let's call it.
Well, there are scholars that say that Marcion may not have written all of them, but he might have written, for instance, Galatians. So it's not an all or nothing proposition.
Right. I know Dr. Price thinks he wrote Galatians, and he wrote the core of Romans, at least. That's what he says in his pre-Nicene New Testament.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and
I've heard him say
Laodiceans,
that
which
before.
was expanded into modern Ephesians. So part of that core of Ephesians is actually Marcion's. Laodiceans a lost epistle.
By the way, Leon, I'm curious, did you find Tyson to be convincing that basically Marcion was the one behind basically Luke Acts was a polemic against Marcion in a sense, and Paul was framed according to the activities of Marcion?
Yeah, I'd have to revisit that, but yes, more or less. Generally speaking, yes, I accept Tyson's general thesis.
I thought you were a Knoxian.
And so was Tyson, actually.
Oh yeah, that's true. Yeah, I did read that recently.
What's the view of Knox?
Oh gosh, I'd have to read it again. Actually, one of the things that this book is maybe making me realize is that I'd like to revisit those books, because when I read them, I was too ready to. I don't know how to explain this. Like I had just started doing the Bible Geek, listening to the Bible Geek podcast a lot, and so I was kind of taking a lot of that a lot less critically than I do now. Let's put it that way. But basically, Knox was the inspiration for Tyson's thesis of what you just said. In other words, Lucan acts as a reaction to Marcionism.
Because one thing that I found intriguing to me but it was the first time I read it was in Detering, was the idea, but I'm sure Tyson goes into it, is this idea that the collection, for example, that Paul speaks about frequently for the saints in Jerusalem was really this tremendous donation that he gives to the church in Rome, which they eventually reject. And in your guys' discussion, since I hadn't done the reading at the time, I was listening to your discussion, and you were talking about how it could have been, I mean, some people make it sound as if it's Marcion's own personal fortune that he was contributing, but you mentioned that it could have been actually a collection from existing churches that he had planted, or at least that he was associated with, that he's taking up a collection and giving that money, just an exact parallel to what Acts is portraying. So
yeah, that was something
fascinating.
Yeah, that was something I hadn't considered before, and it seems like a plausible thing to me where I hadn't even considered it before.
Yeah, because I think Dr. Price, or maybe it was Detering, I can't distinguish now in my reading, but somebody said that, the biography of Paul as related to that collection stuff, a lot of that biography seems to match Marcion specifically, and who would have the ability to travel around and collect letters, for instance, So that's interesting.
It's interesting also to me, John, that when I threw out the idea that I was going under the assumption that Marcion was the first collector of all the Pauline letters, but you suggested that wasn't so.
Well, the thing is, there's no evidence of other collections either, so it's not really that clear-cut. I mean, there's like in Amazing Colossal Apostle, Dr. Price goes through the 4 kind of major theories about the formation of the Pauline collection. And one of the theories was that Paul collected them himself while he was still alive. Then secondly,
is that what David Trobish defends in his book on Paul's letter collection?
Yeah, I think that might be.
I haven't read it yet.
Yeah. Then there's the others, but it all comes down, no matter what theory it is, there must have been collections of some kind circulating around. Different letters, different orders, possibly different introductions and endings, depending on what came before, or what was first. Maybe it had, slightly different text. So there could have been different editions as well. So same letters, collections, but slightly different texts, here and there. But there's pretty much an agreement that Marcion is the first systematic collector that we can, latch on. So it's not, doesn't prove that there was no collections before Marcion, because there's no evidence that there's no surviving stuff like that. But it also doesn't prove that he was the first writer of them all, or something like that. Or what was the relationship between what became canonical Paul's corpus? Were they derived from Marcion, or were they derived from a different collection, a different textual tradition? That's all open-ended questions to me.
Right. Because I was intrigued when I was talking to David Oliver Smith about his theory, and I'm just getting into his book, though I've got so many books I'm juggling that who knows when I'll be able to really do it justice. But his theory is making the case, as you know, that the Gospels were written right from Mark, that they all draw from, they had access to the collection of Pauline letters and to Hebrews. So whoever wrote Mark needed the collection in front of him. And so I thought that has a lot to say with the dating of this,
Yeah, and I'd be really interested in David Oliver Smith's book, too, to take a look at that.
Yeah. By the way, he told me that he only paid attention to the 7 undisputed letters of Paul, because I asked him about if he only found evidence for the 7, and yet Marcion's collection had 10. I was just curious if that, that would have an indication of whether, if he was ignoring 3 that Marcion acknowledged as Pauline, but he said he didn't pay attention to anything besides these 7. That's what he looked for.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that it's been a long time people have said that Mark was like a Pauline gospel somehow. Could have been directly inspired by Pauline writings, or he could have belonged to a planted community of Paul's, but there was like some affinity between Pauline theology and Mark's gospel. So that's been around for a long time.
Hey,
And
Dan?
probably other scholars have actually gone over that too, I bet.
I knew the basic idea that he was from the Pauline, Pauline churches. He was influenced by Paul's theology, but to actually be drawing, to actually see parallel passages that he's actually drawing, he's actually creating narratives and teachings out of Paul's passages, like he specifically mentioned earlier today, a chiasm that he sees in Mark, and that one part of it at the beginning and the end of this pericope, he's drawing from, let's say Romans, particular chapter in Romans, the first, let's say, 5 verses, and at the end of the pericope, he continues that from, let's say, verse 6 through 10 or something. And then the next section, so that's the A and A prime, the beginning and the very end of the chiasm, and then the next part of it, the B and the B prime, are from Romans 13 or something like that. So in other words, he's seeing something that, if he's right, couldn't possibly be coincidental. It's a very intentional. I mean, I don't know if he's right. He may be. When I read it, I may just think, that's too speculative.
Gail, can you give the exact passage of one of his examples, one that feels best to you?
Well, let me just. I just want to see the one that he posted just today, and see, and I'll mention it. But I didn't look at the evidence yet to see if he's right. If I agree with him. But if he is right, I can't see how that seems to me impossible to not be intentional.
Yeah, I saw the reply, but I didn't actually study his reply. I got to go back to that.
All right, he's talking about the passage itself is in Mark 12, 10 through 37, okay? He says, to establish Mark's use of Paul, I showed how Mark 12, 10 through 37 has a chiastic structure. In fact, I'm going to copy just this little section on the sidebar. Let's see here. So the first part actually is Psalm 118 to Maccabeus. I don't know what he means by that, but anyway, he mentions Romans 8:31. All right, to the first 2 verses 10 and 11 of Mark 12. Then Romans 13, 1 through 7 is being drawn on for Mark 12, 12 through 17. Then 1 Corinthians 15, 12 through 14. Then, so that's the middle of the chiasm. 1 Corinthians 15, 12 through 14, and then 1 Corinthians 15, 35 through 51, then back to Romans 13, and then back to Psalms to Maccabeus. Again, what he means by that, I'm not sure, but anyway. But you see how the Romans 13, it starts 1 to 7 at the first part of the chiasm, and then the second part of it, 8 through 10, he goes back to it and picks up exactly where it left off. So that I found fascinating, and I want to go through that and see what his,
Yeah, that's too much to look up right now, but yeah, thanks for giving that to us.
Sure. John, did you ever find it convincing that Dr. Price's case for Paul and Simon Magus?
Well, the Amazing Colossal Apostle was sort of a letdown for me because that book was written like even before I even heard of Dr. Price, and it took years and years to get it published. And when it came out, like other people have mentioned, it wasn't a whole lot about that. When I was over reading it, I'm thinking, well, I don't think the case was even made that strongly, and I just think that now I'm kind of like in the same boat as Leon, is that I'm at the point I'm looking at critical stuff, and everything's intriguing, and it's a lot of big maybes, and hey, maybe that's a good explanation, maybe not, because we don't have a time machine and we don't have any evidence one way or the other. It's just like who has the best theory or what theory sounds best to me personally, So I'm starting to look at all this stuff as like, yeah, that's interesting. Maybe somebody else has something else, just going back and forth between stuff.
Sure. I mean, some of you guys might not want me jumping so far ahead in the book, but I'm just going to, since we're talking about one thing.
I was going to suggest we just go ahead and move into 3 because that's what the subject, right, is.
Right.
Was Paul Simon Magus.
I just want to point out one thing that made me think. I mean, I was open to the idea once I saw the way certain early literature was making a connection between Paul and Simon Magus, just to know that Dr. Price wasn't just an interesting thought he had, but it was something he was picking up on that others had. It was clearly in the history of the discussion, But then Detering points out some interesting parallels between Josephus's description of Simon Magus, particularly as it relates to Governor Felix and Drusilla. He points out that, according to Josephus, Simon Magus was a friend of Felix, the governor of Judea, and that that Simon was extremely influential, and so he chose him to basically act as his representative. He had fallen in love with a girl named Drusilla, who was married to a queen, a foreign queen. I mean, she was married to a foreign king, the king of Edessa. But he basically sent Simon Magus to go and talk her into leaving her husband and marrying Felix. And already Felix had a bad reputation, a violent person, brutal and everything. But he went, and sure enough, he managed to talk her into it. And and then he starts comparing Acts' treatment of Paul, meeting up with Felix and Drusilla, and now the implication from Josephus is, this is his friend who did this, and he paid him for doing it. Now all of a sudden, Acts, when Paul speaks to Felix and Drusilla, he's actually preaching to them about sexual abstinence, and Felix is waiting for Paul to pay him money as a bribe to let him go, and he's showing that all of this seems to be an intentional distancing of Paul from the things that Simon did. So in other words, Simon had no problems with separating Drusilla from her husband and uniting this immoral marriage. But in Paul, he wants nothing to do with that, and he actually, now that they're married, he still wants them to be sexually abstinent. And this idea that Simon was paid to do this, and he didn't have a problem with it. Now Paul was somehow the one expected to give a bribe. This tent maker who's poor and has nothing, and this governor expects him to have enough money to. None of that made sense, except it all seemed to be a clear parallel, a clear apologetic going on in Acts related to the life that was known about Simon Magus. That rang true for me. I apologize if I didn't explain it very clearly, but...
Yeah, all that stuff is intriguing. But it's difficult to sift of, exactly in what way. can it be true? You know, it reminds me of a book I read years ago by a guy named Ralph Ellis, and this book is all over the place, and he's trying to prove all kinds of things. But one whole section he just goes off on a tangent and tries to argue that Paul was Josephus, that Josephus was the name of the author when he was writing secular history, and when he was writing to his churches, he was called himself Paul. Now, I looked this up because the guy said nobody had ever thought of that, and he's right. He's the first one to ever suggest that. And his evidence was the biography of Josephus has a lot of similarities with what Acts says about Paul. So, you know, and that was intriguing too, but, you know, another book you could read says Paul was Jesus if you want.
Right.
And it's, boy, you know, there's some cool parallels there too, and it's just like, okay, what? Whatever.
No, I might end up, after I run with this for a little while, throwing it aside, but for the time being it looks intriguing enough, especially also when I realized one thing that I had struggled with a little bit is the idea, you know, in most of this literature it speaks about Simon is from Samaria, and certainly the Bible's account in Acts says he's from Samaria, you know, that's where they find him, in Samaria. But according to Josephus, he's from Cyprus. So that difference has always made me wonder what's the reason for that. But then when I came to realize from Detering also is that and I felt this for a while, that Acts distinctly wants us to think that Paul only got the name Paul after he converted the governor Sergius Paulus, I believe, in Acts 13. Once he converted him, he's the governor of Cyprus. So he was in Cyprus and he became Paul, and then Josephus says Simon is from Cyprus. I thought that was a fascinating parallel. I don't know if there's anything to that, but to me that was, you know, a bunch of, suddenly I took notice, obviously.
Yeah, but it's hard to distinguish, you know, what's a literary fabrication. It's like Luke drawing these parallels from known things just, you know, for some reason, whatever it might be. But they don't correspond to historical actualities, you know.
I guess the important thing to me is that is Luke, is the writer of Acts intentionally seeing a connection between Paul and Simon and trying his best to separate them? That's the thing that I'm seeing. Whether it's, you know, kind of the historical question is not the most important part of that. Except I do think that, you know, like Josephus, I personally think if Josephus makes it impossible to say Simon Magus didn't exist, that he really was a historical character. At least that's my understanding, you know, is that you have to finally say, yeah, he did exist. I don't see a problem with. Some people are more critical than I am in that case, I'm sure, with accepting what Josephus has to say.
Well, here's the other thing that kind of struck me is that there was mention of things like the Acts of Paul and the Apocalypse, all this apocryphal literature concerning Paul, and as a body of literature, they're like the Acts Paul. They're not the letter writer Paul. They're like the missionary type going around Paul. And Detering earlier in his book kind of mentioned the idea that, you know, you could have some kind of Paul as missionary church builder, and then the idea that he wrote letters to those churches is secondary because that's something that, oh, he must have done at some point. So that Epistles Paul is actually the fiction, but who that Paul was at the historical core of, say, Acts, could be Simon or could be anybody, you know. But those other, it just struck me as interesting that those other non-New Testament documents are all, you know, none of them, unless they're all derivative, you know, you could even maintain that they're all derivative of Acts and the legends of Paul that arise out of that. So, you know, I don't know, one half dozen the other.
I think the best argument is that the Acts are derivative of them, or at least I'm going in that direction. I think that's one of the points I agree with Detering on.
Or that there was some kind of general legend, whoever inspired it. Was it, Marcion? Was it Simon himself? Or was there some guy named Paul or Saul that, maybe wasn't as spectacular as Acts makes him out to be, but he was at the root of all those legends and various things that eventually all coalesced into different types of writing. Maybe.
Right, and I'm open to the idea that there was just a legend connecting Paul and Simon Magus, which the author of Acts is trying to falsify in his mind. In other words, it doesn't have to be based on any history. Just the fact that some people are saying it, he wants to make it clear, no, they're different, like he's going to pains to make sure you know that.
If it was being maintained, yeah, you can understand why he would want to try to refute that. I think what draws attention to people like Detering is to the extent that he goes to it. It's almost like it's too close to being true that it needs to be refuted, not just hearsay or rumor. So right. I think that's what they're reacting to, is that strength of how it comes out, where things are parallel, but then they're reversed or polemicized so that they look like it's the opposite of what you might have heard.
One thing that was interesting to me too is that because I suddenly now I have a fascination with Simon, want to learn more about him and his theology, and I put out a post just recently basically asking basically I wanted to try to consider where does Marcion fit in along the path from a historicist view. Basically, do this Docetus, are they on the path from a historical view of Jesus on its way to a pure mythicist view of the Gnostics? Or are they, as Dr. Price says, an accommodation? So basically you have a mythicist view, then a historicist view, and then the docetic view basically comes third as an accommodation for both views. And I tend to think it's really starting with anyway, I'm putting out the idea that if it started with a historicist view and eventually made its way to the Gnostic, mythicist view, pure mythicist, that the Gnostic view was a point along the path. In other words, from the historic Paul basically saying, yeah, he may have existed, but he was really an angel in disguise. He looked like a man, but he wasn't really human. He wasn't really born to any woman, And so, in other words, wanting to see historically how that idea developed over time. And so I thought Marcion, here he is, that him and his crowd are Docetus. Can you see? I wanted to see basically the development. Did he come before the full-blown Gnostics, or did he come after them? That would be an interesting tell.
Yeah, I think most scholars have an opinion that they think Docetism even was like a step towards Gnosticism. It was what let the nose of the camel underneath the tent flap. That it was an easy step to move from there. Maybe, if you put that as a last development in that chain, it just doesn't seem to work as well. At least I don't think so, but it could.
I think
Go ahead.
While it's possible to infer some hint of Doceticism in Paul, especially I think in Corinthians, I think it was. You don't really get anything more than a hint until the Johannine epistles, which arguably come after Paul, right?
Right.
And so I think that might be evidence of the direction that it's taken, if you follow what I'm going.
Right. I guess because more and more I'm feeling confident to say that I think you guys may have asked me what I thought at one point, what I thought Paul's view of Jesus was, and I think both Paul and Marcion, I think, both viewed Jesus as an angel. In other words, I said at one point, I said a god of some sort, but I really feel comfortable to say he viewed him as an angel. That's what he was, an angel. In that sense, he was divine, but not in the sense of full-blown the Father, you know. In fact, I think that Marcion would say that the demiurge was an angel.
That's. I have to think about that. That the demiurge was an angel?
Yeah. In fact, this is interesting to me too, because I was thinking of it even more when I was. Detering goes into Simon's theology, which seems to be more Gnostic than I realized, as far as, like, he talks about his wife, Helen. Basically, he finds this woman, Helen, who, according to one tradition, he found as a prostitute in Tyre, okay? He ransoms her, basically. He purchases her out of her bondage. And basically, he uses this story to illustrate the gospel. But he says that she represented. In fact, I have the feeling that he really thought that she was a reincarnation of this goddess, who basically the Father created. The Greek word, I forget what it is, but it means, I think it's like anoia. It means thought. All right. He creates her. She's the only one that he directly creates. Then she creates these angels, all right? And then these angels imprison her and send her into the it's these angels that create the earth. And then these angels send her down to the earth as an imprisoned captive. And so the Father, who these angels don't even know, so he's the unknown God, he sends a redeemer down to get her, to purchase her, redeem her. And so Paul, or Simon, basically, in his redeeming Helen from the brothel, you know, it's kind of a reenactment of his understanding of the gospel and what happened. But I thought it was interesting, not only that, but also this idea that it's angels, all right, that do the creating, not just one demiurge, but several angels that do the creating of the physical world. So in other words, you know, that seems to be possibly at least an early stage in this idea of a single demiurge, but it still places the demiurge at least as an angel and Yahweh as an angel, you know. At least that fits the discussion, at least. We're talking about angels creating the world, and the Father has to act against them.
I'm a little hesitant to put it so early, but mostly because I think that most of those details about Helena and all these things, we don't really hear anything about this until the Pseudo-Clementine homilies, which don't, you know, they don't. What is it? The early 4th century, and so I don't know how far back those things actually go. I take that with a grain of salt.
Yeah, I don't know the dating of these. He was actually trying to find anything that Simon may have written.
Yeah.
And he was drawing on something that some have claimed was written by Simon. And it tells this.
In other words, there's such a span of time there that I can't put a lot of weight on what he says was biographical about Simon.
Right.
Especially since if the equation of Simon and Paul is going to happen, whereas, you know, and Detering touches on this a little bit on Thecla. Is Helena Thecla? I don't know. They don't seem similar to me.
I didn't realize anybody. I guess they didn't get that far ahead to realize that anyone connected those two.
No, I'm kind of brainstorming it. But
oh, I see.
He mentions Thecla as being a really prominent character in the Acts of Paul and in several other pseudepigraphal works, but the picture of Thecla that they paint in these works is so ascetic and so
Right.
It's definitely not a prostitute.
No, no. In fact, she's engaged, I believe, Thecla in the story. And Paul, after hearing Paul, she decides, and by the way, his gospel is all about sexual abstinence.
Right.
So she decides not to marry him, and that gets her fiance and her own mother so upset with her. They even want to, mother wants to have her killed. Anyway, but she is suddenly devoted to Paul, but there's nothing sexual, obviously. But in fact, that's the whole over. Basically, the theme almost is an anti-sexual.
Right. Yeah.
Like what is a Encretite concept, I think.
I remember reading John Dominic Crossan some years back, and he devotes quite a lot of space to speculating about Thecla, because one of the things that archaeologically we have is there's this one altar in which Paul and Thecla are both prominent. They almost have like equal prominence in this one shrine, or whatever you want to call it, like a commemoration of them. But the Paul is intact, and Thecla has been defaced. You can't hardly see her at all. She's been scratched out. Which brings up the question: wow, what kind of piety would insist on scratching out Thecla, especially if there's nothing? If she was just, this, sexless, plea for an ascetic life, why would somebody scratch her out?
I wonder if first thing that comes to my mind is when I first heard this story, I think it was Bart Ehrman's book Lost Christianities, where he was telling the story of Paul and Thecla, and the reason why he was specifically talking about it is because he found this is probably the clearest example of pseudepigrapha that we have, because the guy who wrote the story eventually was found out, and he admitted that he just created the story. He admitted he had done it. He was a deacon, I think, in the church.
Right,
and
right, yeah.
He was basically, I don't know if he was kicked out of the church, but certainly was disciplined as a result. And I imagine, so when you talk about a shrine, and she was hugely popular in the church, I wonder if this was a result then of finding out that the whole story was a fake. I could imagine, suddenly you look up to somebody all this time and have a shrine to her, and all of a sudden you find out that this is all a fake, and then you react, in a radical way and deface the shrine. I could imagine. I don't know.
Yeah, but if there's any credence at all to the Simonian Pauline link, I think it's just an interesting question. Right,
whether she is somehow related to Helena.
If there's some parallel there, maybe.
Right, I'll have to think about that too.
And that maybe somebody's reaction to rejecting Thecla was to paint her out to be a whore.
Right, that's interesting.
The exact opposite. I'm just brainstorming, but it's just something that occurred to me.
By the way, Detering did say that some tradition actually had her as, so there's one tradition that has her as having been a prostitute, and there's another tradition as both her and Simon being disciples of John the Baptist. And anyway, so when I knew that, and then suddenly there's a tradition of her being a prostitute, I just naturally assumed that it was a polemic, almost like Mary Magdalene, suddenly making her into a prostitute. I just thought, this is obviously an attack on her character. But if Simon actually used this and played it up and wasn't, it almost seemed like if there is any historicity that he actually either invented the idea, it came from him, in other words. Except
in the case of Mary Magdalene, I don't think it's so much a polemic. I think it's just a result of the proximity of the story of the sinful woman to the mention of Mary Magdalene. Physical proximity in the gospel, in other words. I don't think Mary Magdalene, other than in the few circles where she was seen as the apostle to the apostles,
Yeah.
like the Gospel of Mary and stuff like that. I think that's the only reason they would have to call her a prostitute, and I don't see a strong case for that. I think her being turned into a prostitute is just kind of an accident of history, kind of in a way. I think the first person to do it was Gregory. Gregory of Nyssa, or Gregory the Great, or one of those.
Yeah, or Nazianzus.
Yeah.
All right, that's interesting. I just somehow assumed that if there was anything intentional against her, that it may have been somewhat of a reaction against, in Gnostic literature, she's sometimes portrayed basically as a wife to Jesus, and
right.
And so I just thought maybe that's an intentional and slight to that view to make.
I think
a few pegs.
That's good food for thought. It's basically following along the same lines that I'm wondering about Thecla.
Right.
Well, one thing I can't get past is Tertullian in his characterization of Paul as the apostle to the heretics. If he had have known anything about a relationship between the Paul that we know and Simon, I think he would have jumped on it. But, maybe he just didn't know about it, which is very possible.
Yeah, but I think you're pointing out a key problem, I think. Or even the fact that, Tertullian thinks Paul is on the wrong side. Justin has never heard of Paul. It just Paul is a huge question mark.
And that Marcion is a direct descendant of that Pauline type heretical strain. And the same people will be saying that Simon is the father of all heresies. I mean, you could say that they're all one long lineage, one way or the other. Whether they're the characters are being identified with each other historically or not. There's just this, all those guys are bad,
Let me ask you, John, about that, because I'm a little confused. I've always heard that phrase, the apostle to the heretics, and I guess I had forgotten who it came from, but since you mentioned it's Tertullian, and I just looked it up, and it seems so. The reason why it's confusing to me is because in Detering he's quoting Tertullian to make the case that for why Paul had to come as an apostle, as a real, genuine apostle, and so basically acknowledging that he knows about Paul. He's basically trying to show that it was a prophecy regarding Benjamin about a persecutor who eventually ends up feeding the church. He quotes, here's the whole quote from Tertullian. Actually, I'll read this paragraph too, where he mentions. He says, "Now we already observed above, of course, that Tertullian, in settling accounts with Marcion, had a remarkable interest in finding the figure of the apostle, whom he viewed with great mistrust, which many exegetes today could well take as something to emulate, already prefigured in the Old Testament." And he quotes Tertullian, "Because even the book of Genesis so long ago promised me, the apostle Paul, for among the types and prophetic blessings which he pronounced over his sons, Jacob," so this is Jacob's blessing over his sons, "Jacob, when he turned his attention to Benjamin, exclaimed, 'Benjamin shall,' actually I'm not sure this word, looks like a raven or raven, he will raven as a wolf in the morning." Basically, I assume it means he'll eat ravenously as a wolf in the morning. "He shall devour the prey, and at night he shall impart nourishment." He foresaw that Paul would arise out of the tribe of Benjamin, a voracious wolf, devouring his prey in the morning. In other words, in the early part of his life, he would devastate the Lord's sheep as a persecutor of the churches, but in the evening he would give them nourishment, which means that in his declining years he would educate the fold of Christ as the teacher of the Gentiles. Then again, in Saul's conduct towards David, exhibited first in violent persecution of him, and then in remorse and reparation on his receiving from him good for evil, we have nothing else than a remorse and reparation on his receiving from him good for evil. Excuse me, I guess I read that again. But anyway, he's showing that Paul basically... So here he sees him foretold in Scripture, so the reason why he comes from Benjamin, and then he draws on the Saul Benjamin, and so that's Detering's understanding of, basically he's telling us why it was that Acts says that before he became Paul, his name was Saul, from Benjamin, that basically there's an intentional comparison of him between King Saul from Benjamin, and that's the whole reason for it. But in other words, Tertullian is saying that he claims Paul as a Christian apostle, and the Bible even foretold him to come. So how he could be the one that says that he doesn't even know about Paul, and Paul is an apostle of the heretics, that doesn't make any sense to me.
No, Justin did know about Paul. Tertullian called him the apostle to the heretics.
Oh, okay, but still...
There's probably even more than one school on that, but I think some people are saying that what Tertullian is saying is not that he has a problem with Paul, but how the heretics have used Paul or abused him, you know.
That makes more sense to me.
Sure.
It just every time that I've heard mythicists quote that, well, it doesn't matter mythicists or not, but basically I've heard that ever since I've joined our Facebook discussions, and I keep hearing that phrase, you know, Paul's the apostle of the heretics, and I just assumed that meant Tertullian didn't accept him as a valid apostle, but the rest of this quote shows he clearly did.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
Did he do so reluctantly? In other words, did he have to because it was already part of the tradition? Or...
Well, Detering seems to think there was somewhat of a reluctance or mistrust in him, but
right, and I think a case can be made for that. I don't know if it's right, I don't know if it's correct, but it is valid.
Well, even if he had lingering doubts, I guess the important thing to me is he's acknowledging there was a Paul who was a Christian apostle before his time. Like, it's not something just that I was going under the mistaken impression that he didn't know about any Christian apostle Paul. Only the heretics had their own Paul, but we don't have any. There's no apostle Paul in our tradition, and that's not the case at all.
Just the simple fact that he calls him an apostle is telling.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? If he didn't accept him, he wouldn't call him an apostle.
Well, I just assumed that meant, you know, that the Gnostics were calling him an apostle, so he's the apostle of the heretics. He's their apostle. We have our apostles.
Yeah, but I think there's something to that. I think the fact that he uses the word apostle is significant.
Doesn't Tertullian take Acts and all 13 of the Pauline epistles as being scripture?
Does he? I didn't know that.
Am I wrong about that? I mean, I thought he was completely orthodox in that regard. I thought.
Hold on. Let me look at something, because I read something recently about this.
I know he quotes from Paul in several works, positively. You know. I don't know if he ever came out and said, you know, how many epistles there were and how many should be accepted or what. I don't think that came up as a topic.
I didn't mean to go into that, but I mean, I think didn't he accept, you know, the pastorals and the other, you know, what's in our New Testament? Wasn't that Tertullian's New Testament also?
I just didn't think that the New Testament canon was formed as early as Tertullian. So in other words, like, was the Book of Acts his scripture? What did he accept the pastorals? I didn't know. I thought that would be after Tertullian.
Well, that's why nobody can say whether there was a definitive collection of anything. You know, we know that there was a lot of different collections of New Testament writings, for instance. So you might have had Acts and this or that, you know, in your community, and 7 of the Pauline epistles or 10 or whatever, you know. So everybody had different stuff, I would imagine. So it's not surprising if Tertullian would have had a collection of Paul, that he could quote from. Might not be exactly the same as what Marcion had or what we have, but evidently he did, because I think he quotes from him, from the epistles. So I don't know. Is this a different father I'm thinking of? But didn't Detering say something like, a lot of the quotations from Paul by a lot of these fathers are not exact? That a lot of them are kind of, strangely worded or general, and not corresponding word for word to anything written that we know. I don't know. I thought somebody made that. Maybe it was in a different book.
I didn't, up to where I've read, I haven't seen something like that.
Well, there's a lot of things that are used as arguments, and I've even heard Dr. Price use that bit from Justin's dialogue with Trypho to bolster mythicism. And I've read the section of Trypho that's usually quoted in more than one English translation. And really, it does depend on what translation you're reading for what sounds the strongest as a pro-mythicist case. I'd like to someday read the original language of it, and see if I could figure it out for my own. But what some people say, this is where he's talking about what you say about, what we say about Jesus is the same as what you guys say about the sons of Zeus and Jupiter and that kind of stuff. Or no, that was something else. It was saying something about, that you too create a Christ, implying that Christianity was based on a concocted myth, according to Trypho. So now I've read that, and it's like I've read different English translations that you could mean that, or it could mean something completely different if you read the entire context. So I'd like to actually read the original languages. That's just an example of stuff that you take for granted as being a strong block of a set of arguments that sometimes doesn't always pan out, or it's ambiguous and not as clean cut as you might have thought.
Right.
Reading.
I know what you mean.
But then I've heard people say, no, I read the original languages and it's even stronger than in any English translation you might read, because a lot of those translations are done by people with an agenda to kind of water it down and not make it sound as strong as it actually is. So, but I can't make the decision until I actually read it myself.
Right. Is there anything that you wanted to, direction you wanted to take this discussion, Wayne or Leo? Or John?
No, I said about everything I had to say about Simon and Paul. I'm not fully convinced. I mean, it's intriguing, but so far, looking at the evidence from Detering and also from Price and maybe some other places, it's a possibility, but I don't think it explains some things, but then it leaves questions in other areas too. So I don't know what to make of it.
I just looked up the Tertullian. The only biblical book that Tertullian rejects is Hebrews.
Does he reject it as Pauline, because a lot of people early on said it was by Paul, or does he just reject it?
He rejects it. No, yeah, he rejects it as canonical.
Well, every book has been rejected by somebody at some point.
Yeah, as a matter
Not
of fact,
everybody liked everything.
Irenaeus accepts all of them except he disputes Hebrews, and it's inconclusive with Philemon.
And a lot of them didn't like the Apocalypse at all, so it took a lot of, struggle to get that in.
Eusebius disputes the apocalypse, but Tertullian accepts it.
I know, I was going to ask you guys, I was thinking about this too. The concept of Simon being from Samaria. Now, I've had this in mind that Dr. Price and the Ebionites, I mean, Dr. Price mentions Paul talking in terms of the law being a burden, and how Jews don't think that way of the law. They think of it as a blessing, basically, and only Gentiles would consider it a burden to try to live like a Jew, even though they've never... It's a whole different culture that they have to take on. Nothing is natural. Why do I have to do any of this?
Yeah, that's one of the reasons. That's one of the reasons why I don't believe that Paul was as Jewish as people say he was.
Right, and the Ebionites said he was not born a Jew. He had converted, basically, and so I'm thinking of this when it comes to the idea that if Simon was, if Simon is this historical character either from Samaria or from Cyprus, all right? In other words, if he's a Samaritan, which in my view, they're practically like a Jewish, it's like as close to Judaism as like the Jehovah's Witnesses or Mormons to Christianity. In other words,
right, but they only stick to the Torah, though.
Right. But in other words, that's the thing, is keeping the law. And you won't find a Samaritan complaining about keeping the law. The law in the Torah, right? That's what we're talking about.
Well, the Pentateuch specifically, and the only difference is the place of worship. Jerusalem was not the central point.
Yeah. So they would object over that, but they wouldn't object over... In fact, I think Detering even quotes that about Simon, that was an issue. He thought they should worship in Gerizim instead of in Jerusalem, So in other words, according to that story, I think that was from the Pseudo-Clementine literature. So it made it sound like he was a full-on Samaritan who embraced that idea. But in other words, a Samaritan wouldn't complain about the law being a burden.
But just the opposite, I think.
Yeah, but a Gentile, if he came from Cyprus, for example... Anyway, I was just trying to think of the implications of that. Like, could a Samaritan ever say that? Doesn't feel like it. In other words, if Detering and Price are making a strong enough case that Paul probably wasn't a Jew, being a Samaritan isn't bad enough.
Right, yeah, I agree.
Well, I think Price makes the argument that calling Simon a Samaritan is not actually about where he's from. It's a derogatory term. And he brings up a parallel in the Gospels where the Pharisees, I think that's probably in Luke, but they call it, is it true? They ask him, isn't it true that you're a Samaritan and have a demon?
Right.
In other words, which is like another parallel to Simon, Simon the Samaritan, and a demon like, your familiar spirit that you used to work magic with. So that's an interesting parallel there, I thought.
So you think that might just be just an insult?
Yeah, exactly. Also, the story of when Jesus meets a Samaritan woman.
Your mother smelled of elderberries and your father was a hamster.
Exactly.
Yeah, I have that problem. Anyway, that Dr. Price pointed out that could be a parody about Simon. That Samaritan woman was in fact Helena, or whoever she was, Simon's girlfriend.
Consort.
Yeah, because there was a legend about that she had been married so many times before, something before she met Simon, and in the story, Jesus points out how many husbands she's had, and he says the current one you're living with, but you're not married to, which was the estate of the relationship between Simon and Helena. They were road buddies, but they weren't actually married. So Dr. Price found that could be a parody on Simon too, which I thought was, oh, geez, you can find all kinds of cool stuff. Whether it really means anything or not, it's just interesting to think about.
Very fascinating. Wow.
So you asked me a few minutes ago what I thought we should do for the rest of the hangout. I was thinking we should probably go through Detering's arguments, and even if we don't agree with them, at least state for the viewers what his arguments are.
Sure. I think to some extent we've been doing that, but you think we should do it in order?
Generally.
Yeah, I go more systematically. Yeah.
Okay.
I don't have that
if you
much-
mention that, though, then you're nominating yourself to lead it.
Yeah, that's the problem, is I don't have it well in my mind here what to bring up. First of all, is he right that there's no real sign of the Pauline epistles in from anybody in the late first, early second century until Marcion? I mean,
Yes.
Or is he?
Well, it depends. I mean, this all hinges on the authenticity of First Clement, and Ignatius. And I think neither of the traditional dating of those two books is solid.
Gotcha.
And I would say that we don't know when those books were written, and there's no good argument for dating them as early as people date them, other than circumstantial. Like, for instance, if Polycarp was a real person and Ignatius wrote to Polycarp, you see what I'm saying? But if it's fictional to begin with, then anybody could say, oh, and by the way, he wrote to Polycarp.
Yep.
But for instance, usually the only argument, or the strongest argument, for the First Clement coming from about 95 to about 100 is the opening. And I think that's a really, really weak argument. And if you take that argument away, then we don't know where Clement and Ignatius are date to. And if you bracket those two authors, the next famous Christian author is Justin, and he has no knowledge of Paul. And so that's really strange.
Yeah, we were talking before the hangout on whether the Gospel of Mark knows the Paulines. And I don't think there's a knockdown argument for that, but I think there's so many similarities that they're at least from the same school, I think.
Or at least that they shared some of the same ideas. I'll go with that, but I don't think it can be argued that it knows a Pauline corpus.
The book Dale was reading, I think, does argue for that, but I'm not sure how convincing it is.
Yeah, it's David Oliver Smith's book, and he makes some pretty good points, I think. But like I said, you can argue that the ideas were in vogue, but the collection as such, we don't have any evidence of that until Marcion.
Yeah. I know even R.G. Price, who I referred to before regarding the Gospel of Mark as allegory, he believes that the Gospel of Mark uses the Pauline epistles.
Yeah, I think.
But I was never really persuaded on that particular point in him. Now I see that I see similar themes, but I don't see any actual verses that I see. I don't see anything closely enough quoted that it makes me think he had the actual text.
Yeah, I think it might be one of those things where scholars are repeating what they said. I ran into this the other day. I'm reading about the Ebionites. This is a little bit tangential, but it's a little bit related. I'm reading about the Ebionites, and everybody seems to be in agreement that there was no such thing as a person named Ebion, but I can't find an argument for it anywhere.
I think just take it that the word means poor one or poor
right.
ones. Yeah.
And that's true, but some people thought that there was a person named Ebion, and I would like to see it argued that this was not a real person. And in my reading so far, I have not seen an argument for that. I've seen people saying, "Oh, they just made a mistake and they didn't know that they didn't know that it wasn't a real person." But it's not an argument. It's just an assertion that I keep coming across.
Yeah, I know what you mean. The best I can offer is an assertion too, but I'm skeptical of whether the Ebionites even existed. Everything I've read about them seems to be conjecture, just on trying to make the gospel come from Jewish origins. So people are just trying to fill in the blanks.
Thank you. Actually,
effectively.
That's something that I've been kind of tending toward lately, also. So I'm glad you see that also.
Say that again, Wayne. I missed it.
I don't really see good evidence that the Ebionites even existed. I think the entire idea of of original Jewish Christianity is just to kind of substantiate, like the story in Acts, or to try to put Christianity back onto a Jewish footing retrospectively.
You don't think? I mean, the Christian apologists are arguing against them as heretics.
When though?
What's that?
When?
I thought it was Hippolytus.
Yeah, what year? I mean.
Oh.
Period.
Yeah.
Hippolytus. There's Epiphanius.
Right.
There's Irenaeus, and Irenaeus is probably the earliest, and he's in 175 or so.
But are you suggesting that they're? I mean, you're suggesting they didn't even exist. Are you suggesting then that they didn't? That they're talking about?
I'm suggesting that there's a possibility. It's like I try not to argue beyond where I have warrant.
Yeah, and I was going beyond my warrant there. I admit that.
But what Wayne said, I think, is a good point. I think if there is no attestation of the Ebionites before 175 or so, then that's it doesn't mean that they didn't exist, but it's problematic.
Oh, so you're not saying, since you're asking a question about when, right? So you're not saying that they didn't exist. You're just saying they didn't exist before a certain time, like they were a late group. Because to me, it seems impossible to say they didn't exist when you have Christians arguing against their theology. So this group is an existing group that has a theology, and I'm arguing against it, which makes no sense if they don't exist.
No, they existed.
You're not saying that, because that's an attestation that they do exist by arguing against them.
The group existed. I think what Wayne is saying, and what I am also agreeing with him on, is that placing them as the original Christianity is problematic.
I see. So you think that they may just be a later Jewish Christian sect?
I think that's possible and even plausible.
Certainly possible, yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, they certainly existed, yes.
Okay.
That's what I should have meant.
Okay. I just sometimes some of you guys sound such skeptical to me of saying there's no attestation. When the very fact that we know about these guys is because they're of the attestations of these Christian apologists.
Yeah, but that's why I said when, because.
Right, exactly. Good.
Yeah.
So, how were the Pauline epistles being used when they're first used? I mean, are the issues that you talk about, like regarding circumcision or eating meat sacrificed to idols, etc., are those first century issues or second century issues?
Good question.
That's a good question, and according to the traditional view, they would be first century issues. But then it makes you wonder, why is Tertullian being so virulent against Marcion's use of the Paulines? Why are the patristics still worried about circumcision if it's a first century thing? Do you understand what I'm saying?
Was the issue settled, you mean?
I'm sorry, can you say that again?
You mean you're asking why the issue wasn't already settled? So why
yeah, it should have been. It should have been settled, and so why is Tertullian worried about it? You see what I'm saying?
It was only settled among certain groups.
It's an interesting question.
Detering is referring to criticisms of his view that the Pauline epistles would have to be first century because these things just weren't issues in the second century. But he says that's easy to refute. I mean, because we know people are still talking about these issues in the second century. That's my point. Yeah.
That's my point. Is like if it's such a first century thing, then why is Tertullian still worried about it? Why is Irenaeus still worried about it? Why is Justin in his dialogue with Trypho still worried about it? You know?
So who were Paul's opponents? The opponents of the writers of the Pauline epistles. I mean, of the writer of the epistles. I mean, is he arguing against first century opponents, does it seem, or second century opponents, does it seem?
By the way, Wayne, in connection with what you're discussing, I noticed page 120, Detering is actually discussing this very thing.
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to go through here.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
Yeah.
I just located it.
Yeah.
Well, what do you think, Wayne?
I don't know what to say about a lot of this stuff. You guys are much more well-read in the patristic writings than I am, so.
Hold on, let me find. I don't have my PDF open.
I think I'm about page 124 now. I'm trying to go quickly because we have a lot to catch up on here.
Yeah, I'm probably only going to go for a few more minutes till the bottom of the hour.
Detering tries to argue that Paul has second century Catholic opponents in view when he's writing.
Yeah, I know what you're talking about, and I don't have the exact arguments, but I remember that his arguments resonated with me.
Okay. About page 124 here.
Okay, hold on. 124. Okay.
One of the problems they have with Acts is that it depicts a separation between Jesus' followers and the synagogues much too early. That was a second century issue, so anything where you're dealing with opponents of someone who is opposed to the law or not as strict with the law as Paul is made out to be, that could easily be a second century situation.
Actually, yeah, the topic of circumcision. Right here in page 124 where it says, "But if I, brethren, still preach circumcision," this is from Galatians. "But if I, brethren, still preach circumcision, why am I still persecuted? Stumbling block for the cross would then be removed." And then Detering says, "This is amazing. The opponents of Paul could certainly have made a host of charges against him, but there is one that they in fact certainly could not make, namely the charge that he pursues the same goal as they do, that he preaches circumcision like they do." Oh, just missed
I'm missing the point, Leon. Can you make it clear?
In other words, in Galatians 5:11, it explicitly posits Paul as preaching circumcision, right? Is that the Paul you and I are familiar with?
No. So you're saying that's clearly an interpolation?
It's either an interpolation or a screw-up of some kind.
I mean, it could be, the people in Galatia didn't really know what he taught until he explained it at this early time in this letter. I mean, we know he's against circumcision because of sentences like this that we're familiar with him writing. So maybe this was one of the earlier things he wrote, and people weren't that sure about him at that time.
Yeah, could be. I mean, that's one possibility. But it's one of these. Dettering's case in this particular case is kind of a cumulative one where he's taking these little things that kind of don't seem to make any sense.
Yeah.
But he's basically saying that the Jew, his opponent, it's Marcion who wrote the letter. Marcion and his community wrote these letters, and he's writing them against a Jewish Catholic church that's trying to retain the law right? And he's saying we don't need it, and so we don't need circumcision.
Right. I think he's saying that it reflects what we would call now a post-split concerns.
Right.
And the post-split, as we know it, happened after 80, 86, 90, whenever Jamnia supposedly happened, if it even happened at all.
You mean a split between
the Jews, Judaism, and Christianity? Yeah. In other words, it reflects an emergent church structure, or at least that's what I'm getting out of it.
On 126, Detering is referring to, I think it's Galatians 4:16. Have I then become your enemy by telling you the truth? And Detering, I guess, is trying to argue that this refers to the time in the 2nd century where people are considering Paul to be apostles of the heretics, like you were saying earlier.
Right.
To be an enemy. But how could that be, if the other things they supposedly believed about him were also true? I mean, if he was taken as being an angel at one point and stuff.
Yeah, it's reflecting that it's not just that he's got like the wrong gospel or something, it's he's the enemy. That kind of reflects a later thinking.
Yeah, does that make sense in the 1st century at all? Yeah.
You see what I'm saying? And it's little things like that that Detering is pointing to.
Well, now, Wayne, you're talking about, if I understood you correctly, I apologize that sometimes when I'm listening to you guys, I'm also like looking at the book, so I sometimes miss a little bit. But it seems almost like you're saying that because he's considered the enemy, that wouldn't fit a 1st century situation. Was that what you were saying? Because in my opinion,
I think that's what Detering's saying, but I might be misreading Detering.
Because I mean, before I had never even considered this to be a 2nd century issue, and so I thought that, there's a real war to some extent, or certainly an antagonism going on between the Jerusalem church and Paul and his churches, that Paul is considered the enemy, Paul's the one that's downplaying the law, and the Jerusalem church is a very pro-law church.
Right, but do you think that when Paul, if we take the traditional picture, if we keep that in mind, right?
Right.
The Jerusalem Council happened in what, 47, approximately?
I guess.
Right. And if the Jerusalem Council really happened, and Paul walked away, and they came to some kind of agreement, right?
Right.
Would the Jerusalem church consider him an enemy?
No.
See what I'm saying?
Yeah, so in other words, well,
I don't necessarily think it's 2nd century, but it's certainly not the time period that these epistles are supposed to have been written.
Well, I'm not necessarily questioning the time period per se. I'm questioning the spin on it that the Book of Acts is giving, that they never were enemies, they're always buddies, And
right.
So the time frame may be perfectly accurate. I don't see a reason to question that per se, but I'm saying, because I don't think that there was a Jerusalem Council, or at least let's say I'm very skeptical of this concept that there was a Jerusalem Council in Acts 15 where they all agreed, because I get indications in Paul's later letters after the event that indicate that the people from James are coming and they're trying to convert his people, and he thinks that's horrible, convert them to Judaism, and he thinks, and so I'm thinking if there was an agreement that James even agreed to, that no, we're not going to do that, we're not going to convert Gentiles, and yet Paul's complaining about that in the letters, it's actually happening, so it tells me that the Jerusalem Council never happened.
No, I agree, but I think that even Galatians implies some kind of an accord between the Jerusalems the James faction and the Pauline faction. Would you agree with that?
I can't remember. Can you?
I would. Yeah, I would have to look it up. But it seems to me that although Paul is kind of what's the word, like combative about it, he still kind of acquiesces to James.
Because I kind of got the impression. Well, I don't want to misstep here, but I was just thinking about the time when he basically makes a in Galatians, where he basically shows when they had a complete break, in my opinion, was the story that of his confrontation with Peter, where he confronts him face to face, and it basically is, to some extent, he accuses him. I mean, at first it's just a matter of, we were eating together, and then James comes, and then you separate from us and go eat with the Jews, And basically, he seems to accuse them, though, of trying to make Gentiles into Jews. I forget the exact phrase, But the phrasing of it made me think that he's saying, yeah, they never had an agreement, apparently, because James he's actually either trying actively to make Gentile believers into practicing Jews, and Paul's really upset, and so he makes a complete break. And he says Barnabas was even led along with you guys. In other words, Barnabas was his traveling companion, but eventually he thought Paul went too far, and like that was the official break. So it probably wasn't the Jerusalem Council. At first I was thinking maybe that was the time.
Don't get me wrong. I don't necessarily think that the Jerusalem Council happened. I was using that as kind of a standard.
Right. I guess I was thinking possibly, maybe, I don't know if it was James Tabor or Bart Ehrman, basically was showing that the corresponding break between Paul and Barnabas on that occasion corresponds with Acts' account of the same event, as basically it was just over John Mark, a disagreement. Oh, well, John Mark, he was traveling with us and then he left, and now Barnabas wanted him to come along on our next journey, and Paul was upset about it, and so that's why they divided. And basically Tabor or Hermann was basically saying, that's their nice way of trying to give a nice reason for it, but the fact is Paul gives the real reason why it was really a fundamental break, with the church over, not just over a break with Barnabas, it was a break from the Jewish church,
Yeah, except the only thing I would say is that there seems to be, if there was a break at that point, the collection for the poor is still a common theme.
So I don't want to place it then, because I probably was mistaken to think of it in terms of at the time of the Jerusalem Council. When does he bring the money?
Well, he mentions it in, if the Jerusalem Council was supposed to have happened in the late 40s, and Galatians is supposed to, quote unquote, be written in 51. And then after that, all the other letters come. Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, Romans. Romans, is maybe as late as 60, maybe. And this would have been after such a council, and if the break happened at that point, then where is this collection going to? I'm just kind of brainstorming along too, but...
Right. Yeah, I'm not sure offhand. But I do think it's probably a mistake for me to place his break at the time of the Jerusalem Council, but let's just say I seriously either doubt whether it actually ever happened, or at least the way Acts presents it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm with you. I'm using these examples basically for the sake of argument, but because to tell you the truth, I don't think any of this ever happened. But
yeah, I could see a scenario where they're both fiction, Because
yeah,
that would be placing a schism, a definite schism between Gentile Christianity and Judaism at a very early stage, and I just don't go. Anyway, I gotta go.
All right, John.
This is about as far as I can go.
Good night, John.
All right, John. Have a good night.
Yeah, take care, guys.
Sure, take care.
See you next week, maybe.
Okay.
Bye.
Can I get a clarification from somebody on how thorough the expulsion of Jews from Jerusalem was in 70? I mean, would there have been a Christian center there in the mid-70s and 80s?
I don't think so. I think that anybody who stuck around Jerusalem during from the year 66 to 70 would have been taken to the sword.
So if the things in Paul regarding the people in Jerusalem are historical, the latest they could have been is the late 60s.
Yes, I think so.
Oh, you mean, yeah, the setting of it, yeah.
Okay. So that if we want to if we want to date these later than that, then these scenes can't be true. Or was there a point where Christians returned to Jerusalem? You know, like 100 or something.
There's an apocryphal story, and I'm trying to think of what the name of the town was.
Pella?
What's that?
Pella?
Oh yeah, right. Well, at least there is the tradition that the Christians, they escaped from Jerusalem before it was destroyed and went to Pella.
Pella, right, Pella. And I think that's like that's damage control, fictional story.
I've heard it said that possibly could be the Ebionites' explanation for a continuity.
Right.
Like, that's how they go back to this first century church, is because they had gone to Pella and basically escaped the destruction.
Right. Yeah, I've heard that also, and I don't know how much credence I give that.
So how would Detering be thinking here? I'm trying to think myself what he would be thinking with some of these greater questions here. So it looks like Acts is basically inventing stuff in Jerusalem, but it's actually a stand-in for Rome then. When Acts is saying the Jerusalem church says this or such and such, they're just using it as a puppet for what the Roman church was saying.
Yeah,
so if Marcion wrote these Pauline epistles here, when he refers to Jerusalem, is he just trying to take that back from them? Is he referring to an actual group in Jerusalem, or is he just doing polemical in return?
That's what I thought. I mean, that was my understanding. That Detering saying that if this is Marcion writing these Gospels, that basically whenever he's if he's attacking Jerusalem, he's really attacking Rome.
Okay.
That actually makes sense to me, but I have a problem with the idea that Marcion wrote them.
Yeah, it just seems implausible to me that. I'd have to think about that more, whether the references to Jerusalem in the.
But that's why I didn't.
In the Pauline epistles that Marcion had, with the references to Jerusalem, would really mean anything other than literal Jerusalem.
Right. No, I agree. But that did make me want to read Tyson, because at least I'm more open to the idea that Acts is portraying Jerusalem and the war between Jerusalem and Paul. Well,
it's
I've missed
Acts being a reaction to.
Go ahead.
Just the idea of Acts being a reaction to Marcionism.
Although I guess the reason why I find myself digging myself a hole when I say that is because the concept that they want to, it makes it sound like that the Roman church is trying to reach out. Well, I guess that's the concept, though, right? The reaching out to the Marcionite churches and trying to embrace them by embracing the Pauline letters, which didn't necessarily agree with their theology, but they wanted to embrace. They were such a thriving part of the Christian church that they wanted them to come into their fold, and so they embraced the letters and just Catholicize them, you know.
Yeah, and I just had a thought. I mean, the idea of Marcion coming to Rome and then being kicked out, but initially first being accepted as though he were one of them. There's an echo of that in what you just said. Do you know what I'm saying?
With Paul, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. I mean, the very fact that Marcion wants to join the community in Rome, that he's willing to give this amazing contribution.
That sounds like Paul.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So they certainly don't start out at odds, you know.
It could be coincidental, but I think it's an interesting parallel. It's an interesting echo.
Right. I think there may be something to it, definitely.
What do you think about Detering's reading of Galatians 4:17?
What page?
128. When he talks about, I'll read this from the NIV actually, because it reads clearer here. What they want is to alienate you from us, so that you may be zealous for them. And Detering is taking that to basically be referring to Marcion being, his expulsion from the Roman Church, being, retroactively placed back onto Paul's situation. Do you think Marcion's reading too much into there? I'm Detering's reading too much into there.
I don't know. It's plausible. It's plausible, and it reminds me of the closing of the last chapter where he read.
This isn't the chapter 2 that I'm reading. The last page of chapter 2.
Oh, okay. Where he reads excommunication into that whole.
Yeah, that's
passage.
what I meant. That's what I meant.
Yeah. Okay. I remember I had an issue with that when I read it, and I had to kind of mull it over for a bit.
Okay.
It's a good question. What do you think?
All this stuff is a little overwhelming to me, to be honest. I don't know what to make of a lot of this. Hardly any of these individual issues do I have really much to say about that I can add.
It's not at all a slam dunk for me.
Yeah.
I can kind of see what he's getting at, but I don't think it's a strong enough case.
Yeah.
But when you look at, like I said before, if it's a cumulative case, and it's just like, straw upon straw upon straw upon straw, I could accept it as one of the pieces of straw.
Yeah. So getting into chapter 3 now, which was supposed to be the subject of this hangout. I'm having trouble picking excerpts the way Detering writes here. So have you guys seen anything in chapter 3?
Oh, well, this is where we already talked a little bit about Paul and Thecla, and this is the chapter where he introduces the concept of where he equates Simon Magus.
Do you agree with him putting the Acts of Paul and Thecla earlier than canonical Acts?
I think he makes an interesting case for that, because it's not just Paul and Thecla, but the Acts of Paul in general. There are other ones. There's a couple of other ones.
Okay.
But yeah, I thought that was an interesting argument on his part, because it would kind of explain some of the things that are contained in the Book of Acts that are not contained in the epistles.
Okay.
See what I'm saying? If Acts didn't,
what those things are?
I'd have to kind of read through this again, but things that are part of the book of Acts, if the author and or editor of Acts didn't get them from the epistles, but they also exist as part of the Acts of Paul from other texts.
Gotcha.
It seems to me that there's a pretty good argument to be made there. It's a valid argument to be made that the source of these stories were some of these apocryphal Acts.
And Detering is trying to use this to argue that there were legends, about Paul,
right,
at that time among the Gnostic churches and stuff. So it's not unreasonable that letters could be written in that fictional person's name.
Right, which I think, that resonates with me. I think that that's plausible.
One thing I do like about that is that about his discussion and comparing the Acts of Paul, particularly as Paul says in Acts 15 1 Corinthians 15 that he had faced wild beasts. He had actually fought wild beasts.
Yeah, that one.
Yes.
That one especially.
And
Remember that last time we met, we kind of asked the rhetorical question: who the hell survives a stoning? Who the hell survives a tiger?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And there's actually a story of Paul actually having a discussion with a talking lion in the arena. They had been friends, and I think he'd even baptized him.
I could see that going both ways, though. I could see the remarks in Paul being taken as references to those stories, but I could also see those stories as just being, expansions on these bizarre passages in the epistles.
Yeah, but I can't. I don't see that, and the reason why is because, again, who the hell survives a tiger attack?
Yeah, exactly.
And so I tend to think that the stories from the Acts of Paul and the Acts of Paul and Thecla are more probably the source of those stories than the epistles.
I can follow that. Yeah, I can follow that.
Or at least that's the way I see it. It makes more sense.
Unless something else could have been meant by it in the original epistles, and and the meaning's been twisted over time or something. But I can't really make
maybe, but no, I don't think so. I think in context, he's boasting about what a badass he is and how resilient he is in the face of adversity.
Yeah.
And
could those be interpolations of the epistles? Or are they essential to the flow of the other books written?
Break out your Badoon, man. You tell me.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, I don't have a copy of Badoon, so I can't look it up.
Yeah, I don't remember where that was anymore. What verse that was. I want to hurry up anyway. We're already almost on our third.
I'll take a look.
Finishing our second hour here. Yeah.
I just bought Badoon, so I'll take a look. Go ahead.
But yeah, I think this is one of the arguments that Detering makes that does make sense to me. The fact that the apocryphal Acts seem to have a little bit more primacy about some things.
Yeah, it's actually the most persuasive argument to me so far here.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Are you looking to the PDF also? I'm just trying to think of or see what's in here we should be talking about.
Yeah, I'm kind of perusing it a little bit.
Yeah, he talks about the difference between Apollos Historicus and the legendary Paul, and how they don't have to be the same person in any real sense.
Oh, what page is this over here? Here's another one on page 137. Okay. The face of an angel.
Yeah.
Where this reminds me of some of the writing that Paul, where he describes himself, greetings, Paul, messenger of Christ, our Lord, blah 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 blah, where he's just piling it on. It seems to me that why would the Galatians see him as an angel of God?
Yeah.
By the way,
Detering mentions he also talks about seeing the Lord in the figure of Paul, or seeing Jesus in the figure of Paul.
Right.
That text is in Badun's version of Marcion.
Oh, good.
1 Corinthians 15:32. If humanly I have fought wild beasts at Ephesus, of what benefit is it to me? Basically, that's what he says in Marcion.
And is that in brackets, or is that in an actual cited source?
It's actually in the cited source.
Tertullian or
Tertullian?
How do I find that out?
It'll be on the margin, and it'll also be in the next chapter, which has notes.
What is AD?
Oh, I should know that. I can't think. It's not Atimantius' is dialogues, is it?
Maybe, yeah.
Okay, so let's say Badun seems to think it's not an interpolation.
Adamantius, dialogue of the true faith in God, I guess.
If it's not in brackets, then Badun, it's attested and therefore it's not an interpolation, probably.
Yeah. But what's attested is also subject to interpretation. So you need to look at Badun's notes in the next section of the book.
Right, yeah.
I mean, there's some times where the evidence for one church father seems to contradict another, and Badun's giving his arguments of why he picks one over the other.
See, it seems to me that, if these stories were part of the milieu of the time, and they weren't written down yet, but they made it, they were so popular, the stories were so popular that they eventually would make it to the epistles before Marcion got to the story. I guess I'm just brainstorming out loud, but
What's the earliest that these Acts of Paul could have been written? I mean, is there a way of dating them that they have to be later than 70 or later than 80 or anything like that?
they're later than. I mean, this is hard to say though, because we think that Paul comes from the 50s,
Yeah.
and we think that the Acts of Paul comes from a later time. But let me look this up actually.
I mean, do they mention like Greek and Roman figures who lived at a certain time, so they couldn't have it written earlier than that?
You. I'm trying to look for a date for these.
Just because if the epistles, are derived from these, then
Well,
when these were the earliest these could have been written, places a limit on the earliest the epistles could have been written.
Yeah, I agree, and that's why I'm looking for a date for these, but I'm not having any luck. But that's a good point, though.
And is there any argument for them being before or after the destruction of the temple, or they mention in particular Roman rulers in them? I mean,
I don't think they could be pre-temple, or pre-destruction of temple, I should say.
okay. Is there something specifically in them that makes you say that, or is it just a gut feeling?
Just from if I'm calling to mind some of the stories, and they seem to me to be very Catholic stories. They're not Jewish, you know?
Okay. Catholic stories. Okay, Detering places these acts of Paul in mostly Gnostic writings.
Well, I mean, it seems to me, and especially the idea of Thecla. Sexual abstinence, which kind of suggests the Ankratites thinking. I don't know. This is a good question.
By the way, not to. I just found something that you had asked about before, and somebody. Remember we were talking about Paul's collection for Jerusalem and when that could be, when it was given, and I just found a site saying that the collection was done by 57. I don't know their case or anything, but anyway.
Yeah, I said late 50s, possibly as late as 60. Yeah. But if that's the case, that's definitely post Council of Jerusalem, whether it happened or not, you know.
Right.
Okay, about page 142 is where Detering starts getting into his arguments for Paul being the same as Simon.
Right.
Which I'm sure is true. He's still alive, isn't he? I've actually heard him sing, right? Paul Simon?
Sorry, that's funny. Yeah, the reason I laugh is because I actually had that thought while I was reading. I'm going, isn't it interesting that both of these things would be combined in one? That's funny. You can call him Al, though.
Yeah. Call him Al. Yeah. Now I forgot what I was reading in Detering. oh, yeah, we're talking about Detering's arguments for them being the same. We talked about some of these earlier, but not really systematically.
Yeah, the doppelganger. According to Irenaeus, Marcion was indirectly connected with Simon to the teacher's third.
What page are you on?
I'm on
142.
142, the doppelganger.
So I guess some of Detering's argument is that there's writings that mention Paul or mention Simon, but not the other, but they're describing him the same way.
Right. And I think that is ultimately why Dr. Price accepts that thesis.
But remind me what texts these actually are that we're referring to here.
I think it's primarily the pseudo-Clementine homilies.
Okay.
In Clement's Stromata. Marcion is then directly associated with Simon by Clement of Alexandria. In Clement's Stromata, we read what is certainly a very controversial passage, which, if taken literally, leads to the nonsense that Marcion was a contemporary of Peter. You see what I'm saying?
Why is that nonsense? I mean, maybe Peter, lived in the early 2nd century.
Well, yeah.
If we don't believe Acts about Peter, I mean, what do we
you
know about Peter outside of the book of Acts?
You make a good point, but I mean, we have to discard the whole traditional picture to make that call. I agree with that. Yeah.
What page is that? Which page is this that you're quoting about Peter being a contemporary of Marcion?
143. It's footnote 158.
Footnote 158 just says H. White, Simon Magus 120.
Well, it's footnoted to. That's the source that he gives. But if you look at the top of the page,
chapter 7, verse 17.
Right there, you go.
which I've never read, so I don't know what that's really about, so I can't comment on it.
Yeah, I've never read that whole work either. But it seems to me that Detering is saying that a reading of Clemens Dramata leads to the conclusion that Peter was a contemporary of Marcion, or that Simon, let's say, was a contemporary of Marcion, or that Peter was a contemporary of Marcion, and if Simon is Paul, see, this is confusing.
Yeah.
It's certainly possible, in my opinion, that the Clement story could have not Paul in mind. When it speaks of Simon, it doesn't have Paul in mind, it has Marcion in mind.
Well, specifically, it says Marcion, yeah. That Marcion had been a student of Simon. And so if you take that story literally, it means that Marcion was a contemporary of Peter, which would mean that Simon predates Peter.
So wait, he's saying that I forget who he's saying, Church Fathers, he just says, say that Marcion was a student of Simon Magus, but they're also saying that they never quote Marcion himself as saying that?
Well,
is that what I'm reading this right? That none of our information on what Marcion wrote has himself referring to Simon Magus as a contemporary?
Correct. The people who trace him to Simon and then ultimately to Serdo, and then through Serdo to Simon. The people who do that is Irenaeus.
Oh, okay. But okay, Detering is saying when Marcion speaks of his spiritual father, he speaks nowhere of Simon, but exclusively of Paul. How can that be explained?
Right.
Yeah, I have a hard time with this kind of argument just because we don't have any of Marcion's writings.
Yeah, I kind of agree with that. This is one of the reasons why I'm open to the possibility, and I understand that this is kind of the line of reasoning that people like Dr. Price take to come to this conclusion, but I'm a little bit more hesitant.
But Detering is making the argument that had Marcion wrote anything of that sort, it pretty certainly, it pretty clearly would have been quoted. That's not the kind of stuff they would have skipped over.
Yeah, especially somebody like Irenaeus would have jumped all over that.
Yeah. So that's kind of an argument from silence, but I think arguments from silence could sometimes be legitimate, so yeah.
Sure.
Okay, and on 144, I'm just kind of skipping around here. Nevertheless, this is quoting Detering, I believe that the basic problem here can be fairly well stated with the following formulas. 1. In the Pseudo-Clementines, Simon is known and opposed by name. 2. The heresies ascribed to him are Marcionite. And 3. Even more strange, the words that are placed in his mouth are those of Paul. Do you follow him on that? Are those premises all correct?
Well, I'm glad that he enumerated them that way, though, because I think that's the bottom line for him. I can see the reasoning there.
So which of those premises are you the most skeptical of?
No, I guess I'm looking at them and kind of mulling them over. They kind of make sense to me, and so I'm wondering why my spidey sense is tingling about this Simon Paul connection. There's something still
We can
rubbing
just
at
call him
me.
Al.
I'm sorry?
We can just call him Al.
Hold on, I seem to be getting a little bit of an allergic reaction. Hold on, I'll be right back.
Do you have anything to add at this point, Dale? Is there anything in Detering that catches your eye here?
I'm glad you go over it systematically because then you start bringing up things that I had forgotten about.
Yeah, but I'm doing a poor job of going through it systematically. It's just so hazy in my mind. I'm trying to figure out again what Dettering's trying to say as I'm skimming through this.
Especially when we canceled like last week, because actually over last week I was behind you guys, and so I actually made the effort to catch up with you and then prepare for this week, and so and then missing this past week, so it put me at a distance from all that. Now I'm forgetting so much.
Well, I did all this reading before last Hangout too. I haven't done any, I wasn't finished with the reading at that time, and I got nothing done this week at all.
Today I spent more time though basically on the Simon Magus business, and that's why part of that is still fresh in my mind.
Yeah.
Sorry about that, guys.
Yeah.
What did I miss?
You want to take that one, Dale?
I was just saying how because we took the break this past week, and I had read a lot of this stuff the previous week, and so there's such a distance now.
Yeah.
And I've forgotten a lot of what I had read, so it's a good thing we're actually going like systematically over. Suddenly things are coming to my mind, but I had forgotten a lot.
But
Yeah,
I'm apologizing for how poor of a job I'm doing going systematically through this. I'm looking at what I've highlighted, but some of this now I can't remember why I highlighted it.
I'm kind of on the same boat, Dale. It seems to me you said those three pieces of evidence that he enumerates as the bottom line for him.
Regarding the
said that
Clementines, yeah.
Yeah, that it kind of I could see that, but is that necessarily so, or is it like a circumstantial kind of a thing?
Yeah, are the heresies really Marcionite that he's talking about there, or are they just general heresies that are popular among lots of different Gnostic groups? Yeah.
Right. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And so, is it necessarily?
And when he says, "Are the words placed in his mouth are those of Paul?" I mean, is he actually giving quotes from the epistles he's talking about? I mean, or is he talking about just quotes that sound Pauline? I don't know if he actually means exactly what we have in the text, or if he just means the general theology of Paul.
This would be a great. I wish Dr. Price were here to kind of elucidate on this because he buys into it. He buys into the Simonian connection with Paul, and it would be great to hear his reasoning as to why he accepts Dettering's arguments or what some of his own arguments may be.
Yeah. Detering notes that the first mention of Simon Magus in Acts is in chapter 8, where it has direct connection with the first appearance of Paul. So he brings both Paul and Simon Magus up in Acts at exactly the same point in the story.
Except he makes Peter defeat him first before Paul becomes a major character. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think I was thinking about that earlier, about how Simon is vilified, and then directly on the heels of that, Paul is exalted.
Yeah. I guess Detering is asserting that, the writer of Acts is deliberately doing this to, from the outset, show that they're separate characters.
Right.
That the Apostle Al is not the same as Al Magus, yeah.
But doesn't that imply that somebody is equating them by that point?
Yeah. If Detering should read it right, read this motivation into the writer of Acts, I mean.
Right. But it's an interesting point to see there, or a connection to see there. You wouldn't be denying that they're the same. You wouldn't be explicitly saying no, they're different people, unless somebody was saying that they weren't.
Yeah, because that's not how Acts is written there, though. He's not, he doesn't have a sentence and saying, you shouldn't believe these are the same.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, he just bringing them up to the same point, contrasted to each other, so that it's implicit in the story that they have to be separate people.
Right.
And the sinful woman here, what was Detering's, in page 147, what's Detering's argument here? I don't remember it. Concerning Mary Magdalene, I guess.
Luke is plainly concerned here to counter the speculation current in Gnostic circles concerning Mary Magdalene as the fallen female companion of Jesus Christ, and to show that there is no relationship at all between Mary Magdalene and the sinful woman mentioned in the story of the anointing.
Is this point just to show that this is not the first time, or not the only time, where Luke tries to make one person into two? Is that what Detering's trying to show here?
Right, but I don't think that was the normative reading of the sinful woman. I don't think Mary Magdalene and the sinful woman were connected, were explicitly connected by Luke. I think that the only thing that does connect them is the proximity to each other.
Yeah.
And so I don't think that's a good argument.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I didn't really follow what Detering's trying to do here at this point, actually.
Like I said earlier, I don't think that connection was made explicit until Gregory.
Okay.
I don't think that is explicit. I don't think it is as explicit in Luke. I think it can be inferred from Luke, but I don't think it's as explicit in Luke as he's making it out to be here.
Yeah. That's the end of my highlighting. That's as far as I got.
Okay.
So 148. Who was Simon Magus? Yeah, I haven't read past this point. But you guys want to go past that point anywhere into what you guys have read and talk about it? We can't hold up the Hangout just because of my.
Well, I mean,
we did cover part of this earlier in our discussion.
Right. Was he a Sumerian? Was he from Cyprus? He just goes into the... Actually, he quotes Acts extensively, Acts 8, which is basically this is everything we know about Simon Magus from Acts. Comes from Acts 8 to 9 to 24.
Yeah.
But he does make.
But is there more information about Simon in the other literature outside the New Testament that's early?
The Pseudo-Clementine homilies.
Oh, that's the first we hear. Okay.
And Josephus.
And Josephus mentions him, yeah.
Oh, well, Josephus would be very interesting there then. I have to look that up. But do you actually have that passage available?
That story that we were talking about with Felix and Drusilla all comes from Josephus.
Okay. Antiquities 20.7.2, where a Jew named Simon, who comes from Cyprus. See, in Josephus, he comes from Cyprus. He's not a Samaritan.
Right.
And calls himself a magician, is mentioned.
Actually, let me read the whole thing is quoted in. I have the Amazing Colossal Apostle in front of me.
Oh, okay.
Oh, cool.
Here's the passage in Josephus. He says, "But for the marriage of Drusilla with Azizus, king of Emesa, who had become circumcised in order to marry Drusilla, it was in no long time afterward dissolved upon the following occasion. While Felix was procurator of Judea, he saw this Drusilla and fell in love with her, for she did indeed exceed all other women in beauty. And he sent to her a person whose name was Simon," and Dr. Price mentions in parentheses, some manuscripts read Atomus. So anyway, Simon, one of his friends, a Jew he was, and by birth a Cypriot, and one who pretended to be a magician, and endeavored to persuade her to forsake her present husband and marry him, and promised that if she would not refuse him, he would make her a happy woman. Accordingly, she acted ill, and because she was desirous to avoid her sister Bernice's envy, for she was very ill-treated by her on account of her beauty, was prevailed upon to transgress the laws of her forefathers and to marry Felix. And when he had a son by her, he named him Agrippa. But after what manner that young man with his wife perished at the conflagration of Mount Vesuvius in the days of Titus Caesar shall be related hereafter. So basically it was Simon the magician, though, who was used in bringing them together.
Okay.
Didn't Vesuvius happen in the 70s and 74 or so?
79, in the time of
79,
Titus.
Okay, so if it's 79, according to the traditional story, Paul's been dead about 15 years.
I guess
10
so.
years.
So they're saying that's how they ended up dying, not Simon, but
Right.
So in context in Josephus here, what time period are you talking about? Dating not just based on Vesuvius, but what's in the previous chapter and the next chapter in Josephus? Does this fit a certain chronology? So
that I don't know.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't have Josephus in front of me. But hold on, let me look it up because it's usually online.
By the way, this is interesting. Dr. Price's comments right after the quote. He says, Simon Magus is said by later writers to have come from Gitta, which is in Samaria, but could have been confused with Kittim, the sea peoples of Cyprus. He says Josephus characterized the Samaritans in one instance as Sidonians or Phoenicians in Shechem. Anyway, I shouldn't keep going since I don't know what else, but I just thought he's showing the Kittim. He's mentioning the possibility that Kittim couldn't refer to the sea peoples from Cyprus. I've also heard that, like, Eisenman makes the case that the Kittim, I believe it's the Kittim in the Dead Sea Scrolls refer to the Romans, so anyway.
Yeah, so there's no consistent definition of what that means. That's problematic in itself.
Yeah.
Anyway, placing Simon in the 8th decade of the 1st century, goes back with my gut feeling. I don't have any real good case argument, but my gut feeling that the Pauline epistles stem from the late 1st century.
Right.
And this seems consistent with that to some point.
It's consistent with it for sure.
By the way, this is more important, though, this phrase right here. He says, there is a closer link still. So, you know how Dr. Price is. He throws out all kinds of ideas and said that's what he was doing, but then he gets what I think is a more valid point. And I actually mentioned this earlier, but anyway, he says there's a closer link still, one that connects with the episode of Saul and Barnabas preaching the gospel in Cyprus. Here the author of Acts created the episode of Paul squaring off against Elymas the sorcerer. That's Acts 13:8. Much like Peter's contest with Simon Magus, so Elymas looks like a reworking of Simon Magus. I didn't mention that, but I did mention that right after this battle between Paul and Elymas the magician, then Saul takes on the name Paul. So in other words, he has this battle with this magician, and he comes out the victor, and so Sergius Paulus, the governor, converts to Christianity, and then Saul takes his name of Sergius Paulus. He takes the Roman name as his own, Paul, and it all happens on Cyprus. And he's saying that, so not only Saul taking the name Paul on Cyprus is interesting in connection with this idea that Simon Magus is from Cyprus, but also this connection with the story of Elymas the magician corresponds with the story of Simon Magus, Simon the magician, and his battle with Simon Peter.
Also, if I may, I don't know if it corresponds or not, but is there a parallel between the name Elymas and Atomus in Josephus?
It seems to me I read something like that too, and let me just see if I can find if he makes a comment on that.
Because that would be an interesting echo.
Yeah.
And just to be clear here, the name Simon, that's just a derivative of the traditional Jewish name Simeon, right? It's the same name, just kind of a variant.
Shimon.
Yeah.
And by the way, on that point, the phrase Simon Magus, it's translated in either of two ways. Sometimes as Simon the magician, but sometimes as Simon the Great. And if that's what it is, in Latin, I think that's what it is, just Magus the Great, And in that sense, it seems to me almost like setting him up as the greater Simon compared with Simon Peter,
Yeah. Well, my point of Simon being a traditional Jewish name is that if you just want to take, maybe a fictional character or something and indicate that it's Jewish, that's a name to assign to it.
Right.
Sure. That's a valid point.
But if that's the case, just taking a random Jewish name, I think that it's more valid to say they intentionally chose the name Simon to put him up against Simon Peter as the greater one,
Yeah.
Right. Although you'll notice that in the Pauline epistles, he's usually referred to as Cephas.
Right.
Reuven had wrote earlier that Cyprus had a serious Jewish hatred at the time. Any Jew who landed in Cyprus, even if shipwrecked, was due to be put to death. So calling him a Cypriot, or a Cypriot, I should say, might be to denigrate him.
It's possible. What's your source on that, Reuven? Because it would, if there's attestation for this Jewish hatred, because I think there's evidence, if I'm not mistaken, of a synagogue in Cyprus. From the period. I'm gonna have to. I remember reading somewhere that there was there's evidence for a synagogue that was found in Cyprus, and so that would put into question the amount of hatred that there was.
And Reuven also writes, given the fact that Shimon means he has heard, it could be like the name Jesus given to him later in life.
Right.
And then Reuven writes, under the leadership of Artemion, the Cypriot Jews participated
And the second revolt.
in the Great Rebellion against the Romans ruled by Trajan in 117 CE. And they reported to Dio Cassius to have massacred, and they reported by Dio Cassius to have massacred 240,000 Greeks. In punishment, a severe law was enacted, according to which no Jew was allowed to land on Cypriot soil, not even in case of shipwreck.
Okay, but before then there was some kind of a noticeable Jewish community in Cyprus, though, and they took part in the Alexandrian Rebellion. Yes.
Now, Reuven, that quote has a little footnote 1 in the middle of it, which it looks like you copied and pasted it from somewhere.
Okay, cool. Yeah, that's what I thought. That's why it sounded kind of strange to me, because I know that there was a Jewish presence in Cyprus.
I mean, maybe that could be the source of the hatred, though. I mean, you're not going to be hating people that you're not around.
Well, I think Reuven just kind of explained it. It's because they took part in the second rebellion that started in Alexandria.
But Jewish encyclopedia. So you quoted that from Jewish Encyclopedia. Okay. I'm sorry, I'm losing my train of thought here, and I've forgotten where we left off in Detering.
Last page I have open is 152.
Okay. And like I said, I didn't get to reading this part, so I maybe have one of you pick out excerpts from it.
By the way, Leon, in investigating what we were talking about earlier, I just found this, wanted to mention it. We were talking about the possible connection between Elymas and Atomus.
Yes.
Dr. Price, when he's reviewing Eisenman's book, James the Just, I think it is, he says, and what do you know? He says Elymas is simply Simon Magus, and what do you know? The Western text of Acts gives the name of Etoimus or Etomus instead of Elymas. So he's saying, so the textual variant says Edemus, just like Adamus.
Which corresponds with Josephus.
Exactly.
Right, which is interesting.
Trying to think how similar those names actually are. We got to remember that the us ending at the end, it's just the Greek nominative case ending. So most names in the nominative form will have that ending for masculine names. So
yeah, but
so how many other letters or phonemes are in common there?
Well, but the point, though, Wayne, is that if there's a textual variant, an existing textual variant which calls him Atomus, that's close enough, I think, to the Josephus Atomos.
Possibly,
or at least,
yeah, I'm not.
It's not a sure thing, but at least I think it's an interesting thing. I usually don't.
We have the vowel shifted, and we have the L replaced with a T then as a consonant. We have an M at the end of the root. Yeah, I'm not really seeing.
Yeah, but the textual. But it's the textual.
It is etomus. There is a T in both. Okay, I didn't catch that.
There's a T in both. Is my point.
Yeah.
Or at least in one of the textual variants, which is the one that Dale just brought up.
Now that looks more similar. Okay, I think you just mispronounced it earlier, so I got the wrong word.
But you see that though?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think there might be something to that.
Yeah, a change between eta and alpha, that makes sense. As being the same name.
You guys that were getting about 11:30, I'm thinking probably time to wind
Yeah,
up.
we're gonna have to postpone and finish this chapter next time.
Yeah. That works okay. We got a lot of discussion in. I let you guys just talk among each other to the beginning, first half of this hangout, because I didn't want to force you guys to be following the text, you know, point by point at that point.
I appreciate that.
Yeah.
And when we run dry, and then you can go back.
Yeah.
Find out what we missed.
Yeah. Yeah, but I'm at a disadvantage
least-
here not having read this part of Detering, so I need to catch up on it.
No, it's cool. This will give us a chance to kind of all catch up. So I think this is probably a good place to stop, and then we'll catch up. Right now we are on right around page 155 or so.
Okay. Maybe we'll just call it
And-
148, because I need to reread that.
Okay, then we'll take it from that point. I'll reread part of the chapter. That way it'll be a little bit fresher in my memory.
Okay.
Are we finishing the book then this week with the next chapter?
I don't know. The rate we've been going through it, we won't get that far.
Yeah, it's a little bit denser than I anticipated. Which is, it's okay. I mean, we don't have to stick to the
Yeah. 148 to like 172 for just into this chapter is still a lot of material.
It's a lot of material. So why don't we just decide to finish chapter 3 for next time, and then after that, once we're caught up, then we can decide to finish it for the following week.
That sounds good.
Okay, good.
Is that cool?
Yeah.
All right, cool. So we'll leave it at that here, and thank you, gentlemen.
Yeah.
Thank you.